Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanning here with co-host Matthew Bartko and friends John Breen and Jack Quirk. Our special guests are Skylar Covich and John Madai. We begin with a prayer. Direct, we beseech thee, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, that every prayer and work of ours may begin always from thee, and by thee be happily ended. Today we'll be talking about human rights and, as always, the American Solidarity Party. Let's first return to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. On its 70th anniversary, the Declaration calls for understanding and action. This week, we'll discuss Article 17. Matthew, can you guide us?
It would be my pleasure, Jim. So, Article 17 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights states, everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. We certainly want to take full advantage of the guests that we have on the show this morning and pay special attention to that word arbitrarily that keeps popping up here in this declaration. So let me go first to Skylar and ask for any introductory thoughts you have on today's topic.
Right. Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be on this program. And so I am by no means an expert on economics or any of the relevant topics related to property. So my background is more in political science and especially in interest groups. So, whenever there's a policy discussion, my first thought is, what are the different groups that are likely to react in one way or the other, no matter what happens. So, in terms of property, I tend to think that everybody should have the opportunity to own property as easily as possible, even though my wife and I ourselves are renters right now. We think that there's a good chance that we will not end up owning property. And a big reason for that is one, the fact that we could be moving at any time for work. And then also the difficulty of keeping a mortgage. So if you're buying property, most people have to get a loan from the bank for that, and so it means that the bank has a lot of control over the terms of that loan. So the other thing related to property is this issue of eminent domain, the fact that the government can take away property for various reasons that's they think is in the interest of the state. And so I tend to be more on the side of it should be very hard to use eminent domain, but there have been times where it has seemed to have been needed for environmental reasons or economic development reasons, but it is a deprivation of rights, and because it's not only the value of the property that's important, it's also the attachment to the house itself that many people have for generations and generations of families, and that's important to preserve.
Now, I do want to thank you for bringing up the relationship, as the article does as well, of groups and their interests in property. As I understand it, out in California right now, there is quite a bit of consternation and concern over water rights, which I believe is a form of property rights. And
right.
Even though you and your lovely wife don't own land necessarily, I believe you do own a car, and there is other property that you have. If you've invested in the stock market, theoretically, those companies are part of your property, or at least your shares in those companies. When it comes to the influence of large organizations, be that agriculture with water rights, or banking and finance with shares, or any numerous examples that we can think of where there are interest groups exerting influence on the regulation of property, through our political system, would you say that is, or what is your take on that? I guess I should say, from my perspective, it seems like that is an awful lot of what our politics in this country is keeping those who have property, possessing the property, and in a slightly more cynical view, keeping those without it from getting it. But what's your take on that from your studies of our politics?
Right, yes. So there's often a lot of corruption that can end up happening when interest groups gain too much influence and are seeking after their own interests and not the common good. However, as we've seen from a lot of the discussions within our party and, of course, the rest of our politics, there are legitimate disagreements about what the common good is. And it really depends on your perspective quite often. So for water rights, farmers who feel like they're being deprived of their water rights, they're arguing that they have to have priority for the water, not only for their own sake, but also because that water is necessary to produce food and keep food prices reasonable. There can even be a trade-off between locally produced food and water conservation from that perspective. So usually interest groups, in order to be successful, they need to argue that their policy is good not only for their own sake, but also for others. And if they can make that argument and find some way of gaining political influence, with those two things put together, they can usually end up at the table, at least, and with a bigger share of what they want.
Thank you, Skylar. I appreciate you helping us get launched into this conversation with the various considerations at play. Now, I apologize, John. I don't know that I've ever really grasped the proper pronunciation of your last name.
Well, nobody has, including me. It's but nobody's going to say that. Just ignore the L's and you'll be pretty close.
Midivi. So
yes.
You've actually written a book, at least one, and I believe some articles as well, on topics pertaining to property, and in particular property in a just society. I'd love to give you an opportunity to give us some introductory exposure to your thoughts on today's topic.
Sure, thank you. I think whenever you talk about rights, I think you have to talk about them in relation to two things. One is obligations, and the other is limits, because every proper right is related to an obligation. That's where rights arise from, because a right is just that privilege or faculty you need to discharge an obligation. And limits. Rights are not generally unlimited, but have limits. So in regard to property, well, without property we can't live, without personal property, and I want to make a distinction between personal and private property. Without property, we simply can't live. And the right to property relates to our right, one, to live, and two, to support ourselves and our families and our communities. So a person with property, say a farm, tools, a shop, whatever it might be, has some ability to support himself and his family and to contribute to the community. But a right to property, private property, since property is a material thing, if the right is unlimited, then in theory, one person can own all the property in the world. And while that might be absurd, in fact, it's pretty much what happened. It's what's happening. I read today something from Oxfam that 9 people own as much of the wealth as 1/2 of the world's population. So if property is an unlimited right, then if it's unlimited for some, it must be limited for everybody else. And therefore, they cannot discharge their obligations. So let's always, when we talk about rights, let's also talk about obligations and limits.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. On to our reoccurring guests who also have treasured ideas and insights. Can the Honorable John Breen weigh on today's topic?
So in regards to Article 17, when it states that everyone has the right to own property, basically property is a form of sustenance. You know, it's a source of sustenance where you have a means in order to survive. So basically, this right basically affirms that you are entitled to the means of survival, or combination of both. Of both of those things, then you are entitled to do that. And rights are derived from need. So if you have a need for something, like a legitimate need where you have to eat, therefore you have a right to food. If you need water, therefore you have a right to water. So when it comes to property, property is a source of sustenance where it's a means of producing food or producing wealth to a certain extent. Then you have a right to that.
Thank you, John. Jack, why don't you give us your initial takes on today's topic?
Well, first of all, my problem is that I actually am property. That's not something that's recognized widely. But besides that, I was looking over who was a signatory to this UN Declaration of Human Rights, and I noticed that notably absent was the Soviet Union. This was back in 1948. I'm just going to do a little bit of an interpretive dance here as to what I'm thinking that Article 17 means. John and I recently had a conversation on Friday about property and what it entails and how one gets it. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that property here, while it might have just a standard common speech kind of term, I'm going to think that they're talking about the right to be a capitalist. This strikes me as language that favors one extant economic system over another. But it may not be that. It may just simply be that nobody can take your house, your farm, arbitrarily, and but I don't see a really precise definition of what they mean by property, and that what property is well, that's just I guess that's going to be in the eye of the culture and the presuppositions you bring to that concept. So I'm not it. I know what I mean when I say property, but I don't know that I can say for certain what the UN Declaration of Human Rights means when it says property.
Thank you, Jack. Jim, I was wondering if you could do me a favor and take a shot at what words like property and own actually mean. If we're going to talk about owning property, what does it mean to own something, and just what is the property we're talking about? Feel free to call on our guests to mine the wealth of their material as well.
Thanks, Matthew. One place to start is with the derivation, the language derivation of property. And it comes from, no surprise, the Latin word proprius. Proprius. And proprius means literally one's own. One's own. Various thoughts cross my mind here. We sometimes read after someone is the victim of a robbery or theft that the victim feels violated. And sometimes I think we puzzle over that, at least a bit. But if property is that which is one's own, the term violation makes sense. Now, I also note that we've been talking about the question of a right to what is one's own, and one would have a right to what is one's own insofar as one has a right to one's own proper person. I can't be my own proper person without that which is my own. Now, the question of extent of property is a critical question, and I'm always amazed when I, to use Latin again, follow the injunction ite ad Thomam, go to Thomas, go to St. Thomas Aquinas, as in, let's see what the common doctor has to say about property. And he has a lot to say about property, but one of the most fascinating passages in Thomas with regard to property is a title. It's the 7th article of a discussion in the Summa Theologiae. The title is, I'll bet you'll be surprised, whether it is lawful to steal through stress of need. And when we come to the body of Thomas's discussion, he always begins with objections that he anticipates. But when he comes to the body of his discussion, he says this: things which are of human right cannot derogate from natural right or divine right. Now, according to the natural order established by divine providence, things are meant for the purpose of meeting man's needs. And just a minute ago, John Breen referred to the link between rights and needs. Things are ordained for the purpose of meeting man's needs. Wherefore, the division and appropriation of things which are based on human law do not preclude from the fact that man's needs have to be remedied by means of these very things. Hence, whatever certain people have in superabundance, maybe the 9 people that John Madej was speaking of, hence, whatever certain people have in superabundance is due by natural law to the purpose of helping the poor. And he gives the citation of St. Ambrose, and then he continues. Since, however, there are many who are in need, here's a little something I'd add, namely every single one of us are in need at some time or another, frequently, in fact, during the course of the day. Since, however, there are many who are in need, while it is impossible for all to be helped by means of the same thing, hey, it's lunchtime, I brought my lunch. Oh, you didn't bring your lunch? You can have half my lunch. Oh, you didn't bring your lunch either. Well, at a certain point, that's not going to work. While it's impossible for all to be helped by means of the same thing, each one is entrusted with the stewardship of his own things. And so we have this theme of stewardship. We have it in terms of the whole ecological order. We have a special place in that we can be stewards in a way that other species can't be because we are free and intelligent. Each one is entrusted with the stewardship of his own things. Why is that? Well, in some places, Thomas talks about we have to have stewardship of our own things, what is properly ours, so that we can realize our potential. But here he says, each one is entrusted with the stewardship of his own things, so that out of them he may come to the aid of those who are in need. So here's one reason why I have property, private property at my disposal. First of all, to meet my personal needs, but I also have property because who's going to notice first that my neighbor isn't getting enough to eat? Probably I'm going to be the one to notice first, and if I have something to distribute to my neighbor, then I'm in a position to do so even before some social worker or other could step in. Now back to Thomas. Nevertheless, if the need be so manifest and urgent that it is evident that the present need must be remedied by whatever means be at hand, well, consider the people who live in absolute poverty around the globe. Thank God not so many as did in the past, at least in terms of percentage.
Amen.
Think of the tens of thousands, the millions of people who live in absolute poverty. Nevertheless, if the need be so manifest and urgent that it is evident that the present need must be remedied by whatever means is at hand. For instance, when a person is in some imminent danger and there's no other possible remedy, then, I'm almost done, folks, then it is lawful for a man to meet his own need by means of another's property, by taking it, either openly or secretly, nor is this, properly speaking, theft or robbery. Why isn't it theft or robbery? Now, this is my gloss, not Thomas's language. It's not theft or robbery in a case like that, and such cases must be clearly demarcated. It's not theft or robbery because all that is in the material sphere has a universal destination. It's meant to meet the needs of people. And if in some critical case, and one might argue that the distribution of goods and resources in the world today is in a critical condition, well, then the universal destination of goods is not being honored, and people can't act on their own. That said, there is a humongous difference between Robin Hood and robbing in the hood.
Thank you very much for that, Jim. I want to acknowledge that really what I think you're touching on there is the thoughts that we have to go perhaps too far that this show can hold within an hour of the issues of sovereignty and agency. When does one have sovereignty over a good, a possession, or property? And when does one have agency or lose the agency to act with that property? But that might be going substantially farther than what we have time for.
Good distinctions.
Let me, if I could chime in.
Certainly.
And suggest a distinction between ownership and use. the problem when ownership is absolute, when ownership is for use, that is the 100-acre farm that I farm, then I think it's hard to challenge property. However, when you get to the 101st acre, and I don't have the resources or the time to farm that acre, and I rent that out, now you have ownership divorced from use. And let me suggest with Proudhon, who I think is absolutely correct, that such ownership of things you cannot use yourself and can just collect an economic rent on is always and everywhere the product of government. You cannot collect a rent without the state. If you can't call the cops, then you really don't own that property that you can't use. Let me suggest that when property extends beyond the property that you use, its usage becomes more and more suspicious, more and more tenuous, and more subject to challenge. Because if you don't do that, the right to property would be unlimited, and since we're talking about material things, zero-sum things, when we divide up the pizza, if one gets a larger slice, someone else must get a smaller slice. And that distinction between ownership and use, the property you can use, or what I would say personal property rather than private property, that personal property is yours absolutely. As you start having property you don't use, the right becomes more and more tenuous and more subject to regulation by the common good.
If I can follow up there, just 2 points of clarification. Do you mean to say property that you can use or property you can defend? As you can certainly, there's a chance that you and your family unit could defend more property than you can cultivate and use. I'm
talking about use, not defense. Okay. However, defense has become the whole purpose of the state. That was Locke's purpose of the state, was to defend property and defend it absolutely, whether it was being used or not. So now you have the whole, and I think Locke says more than he means to say. Without the state, you can't have this rentable property. You can't collect an economic rent. But I'm talking about the property you can actually use. Like defend, you can hire as many thugs as you like, or more efficiently, you can capture the state to defend your property absolutely. But that's not what I mean at all.
And then if you could also touch on your pizza analogy, in particular, when we are limiting ourselves to use, if we have the property of the land, we have our talent, we have our effort, we have the water, certainly one could, plant corn and produce a much higher yield with efficiency and, talent being applied to the production, as opposed to someone who was just going to, let the field go fallow and scavenge what they can from it. So I think there is, and in particular, this is a burden on my mind, as James was talking about global poverty, the amount of food waste we have, the amount of efficiency in agriculture that we've been able to attain in getting the very last calorie out of every foot of soil. It seems morally repugnant to me that there are those that are starving to death in this world where we have such a surplus of caloric wealth.
Yes, well, starvation is almost never a natural phenomenon. It's almost always man-made. I would, and I think it's probably a subject for another show, but I would challenge the notion that there is less poverty today than ever. And I would say that there is more poverty today than ever in human history. Poverty has become structural and even the numbers they use to prove that there isn't actually prove the opposite. But that's a subject for another show. But it is quite true that we are producing food in greater abundance. However, that itself is problematic because the methods by which we do that are so artificial and so unsustainable that the soil itself, Wendell Berry pointed out that our problem in the future may not be peak oil, but peak soil, because we're so depleting the soil that it has lost its fertility, and we get these high yields through very, very artificial and unsustainable means. But again, that's probably a subject for another show.
Thanks. I really appreciate those responses, John. John Breen, as we've been covering a lot of material here, I'm wondering what your observations and thoughts have led you to.
Excuse me. I did a little bit of reading of Pope Francis's latest papal encyclical, Laudato Si, and where he's pointing out the environmental issues that is going on with our common home, namely the earth. And basically, from what I gather from my brief reading of it, is that the earth is bearing the consequences, the environment is bearing the consequences of our collective and individual selfishness in regards to helping our neighbor. So if we exploit the earth to a certain degree, where we're trying to get maximum production but not put anything back, and in the meantime deny our neighbor, it's bearing its consequences on the earth, and the earth can't. The earth can only sustain that for so long. So it's. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that that our actions have a rippling effect, and it basically goes into the ground to a certain degree. In regards to, I don't remember the author's name, the gentleman who's with us here who is an author, but I would just simply suggest that when it comes to land ownership, as a means of property, there are many means of property, and property is not simply limited to the ownership of land. There's many types of property. So the whole pie, the whole pizza cut idea, I'm not sure if that's conducive to the subject of property, because there's many forms of it, not just specifically tied to land ownership. And not everybody is capable of owning land. And if the right to ownership is contingent on our ability to use it, then I think we're in a lot of trouble here. I'm not so sure that ownership is simply contingent on our ability to use it.
Well,
if
we're talking,
I just want to clarify something real quick with John Breen here. When you're talking, not everyone is able to own land. What is it that you think is necessary to be able to own land? In other words, what attributes factor into that in your consideration? Still with us, John?
Is that for me or for John Breen?
John Breen, are you still here? In that case, I'll give you, John Dimitivi, the opportunity to respond to what John Breen was saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about ownership of physical things, you are obviously talking about things that, for the example of the pizza being divided, that's a zero-sum game. The material world is, well, obviously always a zero-sum game. If you're talking about ownership of, say, things that can be shared, things like knowledge, my possession of knowledge, as small or large as it might be, does not limit anybody else's possession of knowledge. But possession of land obviously does. If I own all the land, then you can't own any of the land. That's pretty obvious. So the kinds of property we're talking about, though, that are at issue are precisely those physical kinds of property where more for one means less for the other.
So
Matthew.
I'd like to turn. Yes.
Matthew, I'm a terrible clock watcher, and we've been doing great stuff here, but all of our discussion about property is supposed to be nudging us towards distributism. And I think maybe the word distribute and the word distribution, I think they've been used, but we haven't talked about distributism itself. And we have John Madai here with us, who is a distributist, so I wonder if we could redirect him. But before we redirect him, I want to ask Jack Quirk, who mentioned that he had the delight of having John Madai on his show. I just want to ask Jack Quirk, did you find that John Madai's moniker, cockeyed optimist, is appropriate?
Cockeyed optimist? I'm not sure I follow.
Well, sometimes John Madai has been said to be a party pooping pessimist, but we don't really think of him in those terms. We think of him more as an optimist, but a cockeyed optimist. Do you want to go that far?
Well, you know what? I had a really good conversation with John on Tuesday night, and it was, I don't know that optimism or pessimism actually came into it, but I think that we had, I think we had an interesting conversation about distributism and what it all entails.
That's enough of a recommendation for us, John. Could you get us going, if Matthew thinks it's okay, right smack dab at distributism? Yes,
I start by saying I've been accused of many, many sins. Optimism has never, ever been one of them. But to go back to distributism, I think Proudhon's, although I don't think Chesterton or Belloc would ever acknowledge Proudhon, but I think Proudhon's distinction between ownership and use tends naturally towards distributism. I mean, if people own what they can use and don't own what they cannot use, you've eliminated economic rent.
Didn't he get that distinction from the Franciscans in the 1200s? No. Well, I don't know if he might have got it from the Franciscans. That's a good point. Yes. I hadn't thought about that, but yes. Theft. Property is theft. Even the property, intellectual property, gained control of by Proudhon turns out to be theft from the Franciscans of all people.
Yes. No, I had forgotten that. I think you're quite right. I think it goes back to those arguments in the 14th century over the covenantals and all of that stuff. But yes, that would be interesting to pursue. Now that you brought that up, but I think when I've introduced the term, other people have used it. It's not original with me, but the idea of an intermediate state between collective property and private property is personal property, and I think the right to personal property is inviolate. The right to private property, well, Augustine says that private property is correctly named because in Latin, private indicates a privation, so private property is a privation of private property is a privation of property. So, and I think he's correct. The more private property there is, the less personal property there can be. So, distributism then is the idea that everybody ought to have their own personal property, sufficient to meet their needs and the needs of their family. And that's not, by the way, original with the distributists. It goes back, for example, to St. Basil the Great. It goes back to Ambrose. It goes back to a number of the church fathers who were very, very suspicious of the notion of a purely private property.
And so you see the roots of distributism there.
Oh, yes, very strongly. Yeah.
And now, what would it mean? What would it mean for us today?
What does it mean for? Well, that is, we have to have a new attitude towards property. We have to question the idea, maybe found in the UN Declaration on Rights, and maybe for the precise reason the Soviets wouldn't sign up to it, is that property is an unlimited right. Like all proper rights, it has a purpose, and insofar as it fulfills that purpose, then it is legitimate. When it acts contrary to that purpose, when it acts contrary to the common good, then that right may be questioned. And I think that goes back to what James was saying about St. Thomas. St. Thomas supported private property as something practical and prudential. But he recognizes that the natural law indicates the common ownership of property. Private property is a human addition to the natural law, according to Thomas, made for prudential reasons. But when those reasons are no longer fulfilled, then that right to property, private property, becomes tenuous at best.
So I think that one of the things that we're grappling here with, and as I usually don't like to berate or yell at our guests, but I feel the need to pick on Jack and John here a little bit for not mentioning the name of their book or the name of their radio program or respective blogs and articles. There's no shameless self-promotion going on here, and I think that's something that needs to be corrected. But
well, I've been accused of many things, but having shame is never one of them.
So Jack, now he's wearing his lederhosen.
Jack, let me start with you, and then when you're done, John, you can go right ahead. I'd like you to just highlight some of the resources that you're connected with that would let our listeners learn more about this topic of distributism. And then as you do that, if you could work into it a little bit, I've heard people say that the Catholic Church, and this is a Catholic radio station, is opposed to both unbridled capitalism and communism, and that people have described distributivism as a third way, if you will. So I'm wondering, what is distributivism as compared to capitalism, communism, or the third way I'm more familiar with would be called a social market economy, like what we have in the Scandinavian model countries. So if you could just kind of let us know where distributivism is in that family of economic thought, and also recommend some resources, including your own. And Jack, if you could go first, and then John, that would be great.
Well, I blush to talk about distributism in with John Madai present, who is one of the foremost distributive thinkers nowadays. But to me, it is just simply the difference between when you're talking about socialism, which classically understood was the abolition of the right to own the means of production, or which is, or otherwise known as productive property, when distributors talk about it, versus capitalism, which tends to percolate into ownership of the means of production that is owned by just a few people. Distributism seeks a way in which ownership of productive property is widely distributed, and I think that's the closest I can come to a Cliff Notes explanation of that. And I think that is what the body of Catholic social teaching moves towards and advocates. And so, when you said my own resources, are you talking about Christian democracy, or what do I derive that from? Or?
But Christian democracy was what I was primarily thinking of. But anything else?
That's Christian democracy is it's an online, well, now it's a Pathos blog, and the resources that it utilizes are magisterial sources. The goal isn't to try and get to distributism per se, but to take a look at magisterial Catholic social teaching and try to apply it to contemporary affairs. Now that ends up most of the time being fairly distributist, as I understand it. But that's it's really a very simple idea, and that is if we take a look at the news of the day, as it were, and we look at and then take a look at Catholic social teaching and apply it, and that's been the goal, and I do it with more or less success and more or less competence. But that's the goal. And distributism is also, or the principles of distributism end up neatly fitting in quite well.
Matthew?
Yes, Jim.
Jim, here I am watching the clock again, and believe it or not, we only have 14 minutes left. Now, John Quirk just said that he does it as well as he can in terms of distributism, and so does the American Solidarity Party. And I wonder if we couldn't redirect our discussion to Skylar Covich using this distributism as a segue into his thoughts on how the party is doing and where it's going. After all, he is the new chair of the National Committee.
That works for me, Jim. And then, Skylar, if you run out of talking points, which seems unlikely, you can kick it back to John, and I'm sure Jim will interrupt to close us in prayer as he always does.
Yes, and of course I'm glad to take any more specific questions as well, but generally speaking, my goals for the party are to recruit more candidates similar to Monica Solar, who ran for New Jersey legislature last year and is now on the National Committee with me, as well as the 4 candidates who ran in June in California, who I believe were all on an episode of this show together. Brian Carroll for Congress, Ed Rushman for Congress, Desmond Silvera for governor, Kevin Egger for San Diego City Council. I think all of them in different ways were able to get the message of solidarity out into their communities and even throughout the state and throughout the country, but most importantly, in the places where they were running. You know, they did that by having meetings with people who, you know, both who would be likely to agree with us and people who would disagree with us, and developing policy points that could be used for future campaigns that might even have more resources. But unfortunately, we're a bit behind on...
Still there, Skylar?
We must have had a bit of a glitch.
So, with Skylar dropping off temporarily in the few minutes we have left, I just want to open up to anyone who's familiar with the platform of the American Solidarity Party. And in particular, I'm curious on John's view, Dimidvi. Would you consider the American Solidarity Party to be a distributist party?
Well, I'm sure it is, from to a greater or lesser extent, and depending upon which member you're talking about. But first, let me get in my shameless self-promotion, because that's important, as you pointed out. The 2 books that I've authored are The Vocation of Business, Catholic Social Justice in the Marketplace, and the second book. Now that's a textbook. That's the book I use for my class where I teach business students about the social encyclicals. The second book is, the title is Toward a Truly Free Market, a Distributist Perspective, but I think the content is more, that's the publisher's title. My title for the manuscript was Equity and Equilibrium, and the idea is that you could not have an equitable, a society in equilibrium without there being equity, without there being justice. And justice is the key to economic order and to a sound economics. So anyway, those are my 2 books. As for the party, I am less expert on this. I have to say that I have not participated. Matter of fact, I've done my best to keep out of all the various disputes, although I was somewhat dragged into one of them over the affair of the $10 bill. But nevertheless, I think the major use of a third party is not to win elections, because it won't, but to be, as I think Skylar was intimating, was to be a means of spreading ideas, of education, of popularizing of ideas, and to try to impact, not through electoral victories, but through education, the course of the two major parties, who are likely to remain the two major parties.
I recall back in 2017, when we were having copious amounts of debates in internal party communications as to Georgism or distributism or capitalism, and we even had a few communists chiming in. We were able to tempt you into a few conversations. The platform that came out of that process is my primary interest on your judgment on. If you have had the opportunity to review the finished platform, do you think that document would count as distributist as opposed to how some of the members operate?
Yes, I think it would. See, we always have a problem because distributism is not something you can really have a platform. We're not going to get the distributist state, through in a few years through a legislative program. It has to be something that grows organically. My view is that you want to move by stages. So you want to encourage cooperatives through setting up more legal forms for it, because right now the legal basis is fairly weak. You want to tax advantage them. You want to give them regulatory advantages. I mean, for example, if the workers really control a company, you probably don't need to regulate their occupational health and safety standards very much. I mean, they're going to do that themselves. You probably don't need to regulate their wages too much. They're going to do that themselves, so long as the workers have actual control and not merely nominal control. So there's many things you can do in law that encourage the development, the organic development of a distributive society. But one of the primary things we have to do, though, is challenge the notion of absolute property. Absolute property, I don't think, is compatible with both with sound economics, because it leads to economic rent, which is the primary measure of economic inefficiency, and it obviously restricts property to everything, for everybody else. I mean, the great irony of our age is that capitalism has gathered production in vast corporate collectives. It is more collectivist than Stalinism. And in fact, a Stalinist bureaucrat would drip with envy at how successful capitalism has been at collectivizing production. So that's...
John?
Yes.
Jim here. Does your point lead us to understanding of Chesterton's famous line, too much capitalism does not mean too many capitalists, but too few capitalists?
Abso-damn-lutely. The odd thing about capitalism and communism, in communism maybe 15% of the people are members of the party, are the ruling class. In capitalism, maybe 15% are actual capitalists. So they share that sort of concentration on a party elite. It's in many ways, capitalism and communism, Zizek, Slavoj Zizek noted that communism is the absolute capitalist fantasy, where production is gathered in just these few collectives. controlled by a small bureaucracy.
How would you, though, respond to the claim that there clearly is a difference between capitalism in practice and communism in practice, in that in capitalist countries, civil rights have far more recognition, that there's far greater freedom of speech?
Well, I think that's an accident of history. If you look at the capitalist economies of both Russia and China, you will not find that freedom of speech. So, and in fact, as H.L. Mencken noted, freedom of the press is guaranteed to anybody who owns one. I think today, however, we have a different situation with the internet. We have, we have unlimited freedom of speech. And now we find we have to limit that freedom of speech because it's subject to manipulation by forces, well-funded forces who can influence the public in ways that have never been available before. But it does indeed provide an interesting dilemma.
We're down to 4 minutes, and I see that John Breen is back on our screen. I don't know what's happened to Skylar, but with our low-rent internet technology, strange things happen. But I wonder, John, could you make a final comment since you got bumped somehow?
Sure. I was having difficulty taking my mute button off, so I'm using my phone as my Skype. So when it comes to distributism, I'm not very economically astute. I know a little bit, but not much. But from what I gathered of it is that distributism strives towards the proper balance between capital and labor, and where both of them where they both need each other, they both work together to bring about the common good and to bring prosperity to both. So that's kind of my take on distributism, and that also with distributism there's the element of subsidiarity where things are dealt with at the local level, and that issues are dealt with and solved at the local level, as opposed to going from the top side down. You work from the downside up. Sorry.
I think that's very much the spirit of distributism. I'd like to end now with a prayer, although let me say this prayer is a prayerful reflection, and it's something that comes to us from Jacques Maritain. And people who are familiar with the history of Christian democracy and its intellectual sources know that Jacques Maritain was a central source of the thought of the Christian democratic parties in Europe and in South America as well. Here's Maritain. The gospel tells us that we are in the world and not of the world, which is to say that the effort which we make in the world will remain incomplete in the world, but that we are nevertheless bound to make it all the more hopefully in the assurance that it is completed elsewhere, and that the little good we may be able to procure on this earth, and ever so much more our sufferings and our very infirmities, are put to very good account by Him whom we love. We're at the end today. Thanks to all our regulars. Thanks to our visitors. We'll be back next week, same time, same station. God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.